The old church stood in silence, its tall stone walls covered in ivy, as the evening sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red. Inside, Father Elijah sat alone in his candlelit study, flipping through the brittle pages of an ancient book. The air smelled of old paper, wax, and a faint scent of burning incense. For years, Elijah had dedicated his life to faith. He had guided lost souls, helped the poor, and preached kindness. But deep inside, there was one thing that always troubled him: understanding the true thoughts of people. No matter how much he prayed, no matter how much he listened, he could never know what was really in people's hearts. They confessed their sins, but was that the whole truth? They spoke of faith, but did they truly believe? He had seen people wear false smiles, speak false words, and hide secrets behind their eyes. That's when he found it. The book was old, too old. Its leather cover was cracked, and its pages were yellow, almost crumbling at the touch. But the words inside were clear. The text described a ritual, one that claimed to open the mind to the thoughts of others. It was written in an ancient tongue, but Elijah had studied many languages during his years in the church. He who performs the sacred rite shall hear the unspoken words of men. His heart pounded. Could it be real? A way to truly understand people, a way to finally hear their thoughts. The idea excited him. Maybe this was a gift from God. Maybe he was meant to find this book. Maybe, just maybe, this was his purpose. He read further. The ritual was simple: a prayer, a candle, a drop of blood. His hands trembled as he prepared. He placed a single candle on the wooden table, its small flame flickering in the dim room. He whispered the words exactly as they were written. The language felt strange on his tongue, heavy and powerful. Then, taking the small knife, he pressed the tip against his fingertip and let a single drop of blood fall onto the candle's flame. The moment the blood touched the fire, the flame flickered wildly, as if it had come alive. A sudden chill ran through the room. The candlelight grew dim, and for a moment, everything was silent. Too silent. Then, he heard it. At first, it was a whisper, soft, distant, like a voice carried by the wind. Why does he always judge me? Elijah's breath caught in his throat. The voice wasn't his own. It was inside his mind. I hate coming to this church. Another voice, then another, then more. If only they knew what I really did last night. I smile at him, but I don't trust him. The whispers grew louder. I don't believe in God. His heart pounded. He turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind him, but the room was empty. No one was there. Yet he could hear them. Not with his ears, with his mind. The realization sent a wave of fear through him. The ritual had worked. Elijah stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. He shut his eyes, trying to focus, trying to block out the voices, but they wouldn't stop. They were coming from outside. Rushing to the window, he looked down at the small village near the church. People walked through the streets, talking, laughing, going about their evening. But now, Elijah heard more than just their words. I wish my husband would disappear. I stole money today. No one will ever know. He looks at me like a saint, but if only he knew what I really think of him. Elijah gasped. These were the thoughts of his own people, his followers, his believers. And they were not what he expected. Dark secrets, lies, hatred, doubt. He had always believed in the goodness of people, but now he knew the truth. A sharp pain shot through his skull. The voices were getting louder, overlapping, screaming into his mind. Too many thoughts. Too many words. Too much. Stop, stop, stop. He clutched his head, sinking to his knees, his breaths quick and ragged. The candle's flame flickered violently as if reacting to his panic. And then, a new voice. Deeper, stronger, not human. You should not have listened. Elijah's eyes shot open. His hands trembled. His body felt cold. This was no gift from God. The voices inside his head weren't just from people anymore. Something else had heard him, and it was listening. Elijah gasped for breath, his chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven motions. His hands trembled as he gripped the wooden floor beneath him, his mind drowning in the flood of voices. They poured in like a relentless storm. Whispers, shouts, confessions, fears, words that were never meant to be heard. His skull ached as if it were splitting open. Every thought from the villagers outside crashed into his mind without warning. He could hear the baker's regret for overcharging an old woman, the blacksmith's guilt over something buried beneath his forge, the mayor's hidden desire for power masked by his false humility. But amidst the chaos, one thought, one voice, stood apart from the rest. It was not human. You should not have listened. The deep, ancient voice slithered through his mind, cutting through the noise like a knife. Unlike the frantic whispers of the villagers, this presence was cold, deliberate. It did not belong to a man, nor did it belong to anything Elijah had ever encountered before. His breath hitched. The candle on the table flickered wildly, as if something unseen had moved through the room. "Who are you?" Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible. No answer. His pulse pounded in his ears as he pushed himself up, staggering toward the desk. The ancient book lay open where he had left it. Its pages seemed darker now, the ink almost shifting in the dim candlelight. He scanned the text, searching for anything, any warning, any way to reverse what he had done. And then he saw it, the final passage of the ritual. A line he had overlooked in his eagerness. To hear is to be heard. To open the mind is to invite those who dwell beyond. A shiver ran down his spine. This was no simple trick of the mind. He had not just learned to hear thoughts. He had made himself a beacon. A soft knock echoed through the room. Elijah froze. Another knock. Slow, rhythmic. He turned his head toward the heavy wooden door, his throat dry. His trembling fingers reached for the candle, the only source of light in the room. The flame flickered again, stretching unnaturally toward the door, as if something on the other side was pulling it in. Knock, knock, knock. He wasn't expecting visitors. His breath shallow, Elijah took slow steps forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. His fingers brushed against the door handle, hesitating. And then a voice, not from his mind this time, but from the other side of the door. "You hear us now. Let us in." Elijah staggered back. Bus. Not one, but many. The voice was wrong. Twisted. It was layered, as if several voices spoke in unison. Some were deep, others shrill, but they blended together in a way that sent ice through his veins. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out, but his body remained frozen in place. The candle's flame snapped out, leaving him in complete darkness. And then the door creaked open, slowly, painfully, revealing nothing but a void of shadows. Something moved in the darkness. Elijah's mind raced with prayer, with scripture, with anything that might protect him. But the voices in his head only grew louder, laughing, whispering, taunting. You wanted to know their thoughts. Now you will know ours. The darkness poured into the room like living smoke, wrapping around his limbs, crawling up his skin. It was inside him now, twisting through his mind, deeper than even the human voices had gone. And in that moment, he realized the truth. This was never about hearing human thoughts. Something had been waiting, watching. And the moment he listened, they listened back. His screams echoed through the empty halls of the church, swallowed by the night. Elijah's world was unraveling. The moment the darkness seeped into his mind, he lost all sense of time. His screams had long since faded, replaced by ragged breaths and wide, unblinking eyes. He was still in the church, or at least what was left of it. The wooden walls, the candle-lit altar, the pews where the faithful once sat. Everything flickered in and out of existence like a dying flame. And the voices. Oh, the voices. They didn't just whisper anymore. They sang. A dreadful, discordant chorus that looped over and over, each word carving into his thoughts like a rusted blade. We see you. We hear you. You called, so we answered. Elijah clutched his head, nails digging into his scalp as if he could rip the voices out. But they were inside him now, woven into his very being. He was no longer just a man. He was a door. A cold wind swept through the ruins of the church, carrying whispers from the abyss. The once solid walls now pulsed like living flesh, their wooden structure warping, stretching, twisting. The altar, once a place of prayer, had rotted into a grotesque mass of tendrils, reaching toward him as if hungry. And then, for the first time since the ritual, Elijah felt something else inside his mind. Not just a whisper, not just a thought. A presence, something old, something watching. His breath hitched, and in that instant, his vision shifted. He was no longer standing in the ruined church. He was somewhere else. A vast, endless void stretched before him, pulsing with a sickly blue glow. Floating monoliths, covered in symbols he could not comprehend, hovered in the distance, shifting in and out of existence. And at the center of it all, a figure. It was tall, impossible in its size, yet somehow standing just before him. Its form was ever-changing, human one moment, something else the next. 1,000 shifting faces, all speaking in unison, their mouths moving without sound. And then, it noticed him. Elijah felt its attention like a physical force, pressing down on his soul. His knees buckled. His breath came in short gasps. You opened the way. The voice was not sound. It was inside him, vibrating through his bones, filling the hollow spaces in his mind where his own thoughts used to be. You hear us. Now, we will be heard. The monoliths trembled. The void cracked. And suddenly, Elijah was falling. He crashed back into his body, the church returning in a blur of pain and nausea. He stumbled forward, hands gripping the pulpit, his whole body trembling. The shadows in the room were deeper now, stretching unnaturally, watching. The door to the church stood open, the village beyond eerily silent. And then he saw them. Figures stood at the entrance, dozens of them. The villagers. But something was wrong. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow voids. Their mouths hung open, whispering words that made no sound. Elijah staggered back. No, this isn't real. This isn't. But deep down he knew. They had heard the voices too. And now, they belonged to them. The first villager stepped forward. His body moved in jagged, unnatural motions, like a marionette with tangled strings. Then another, and another. Elijah's heart pounded. He had to get out, had to escape. But as he turned, something else moved behind him. The altar. The shadows beneath it shifted, and from the darkness, something began to crawl out. Elijah could do nothing but watch as the thing he had invited in, began to take form, a shape that was almost human, but not quite. And then it spoke. You cannot close the door, Elijah. You are the door. And Elijah finally understood. There was no going back. Elijah staggered backward, his breath ragged as the thing crawled out from the altar's shadows. It moved like liquid darkness, shifting and twisting, its form barely holding together. It had too many limbs, too many faces. The villagers, their blank eyes and whispering mouths, stood motionless behind him. They weren't attacking. They weren't screaming. They were waiting for it. Elijah clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. He had spent his life preaching about faith, about the light of the divine, about standing against darkness. But now, standing in the heart of the church he once called sacred, he realized something terrible. There was no light here. The thing rose to its full height, its presence pushing against reality itself. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very fabric of the world was unraveling in its presence. "You opened the way, Elijah," it said. Its voice wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, inside him, outside him, in the walls, in the wind, in the bones beneath the earth. Elijah's knees buckled. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it didn't matter. He could still hear it. "Do you know what you are?" the thing asked. Elijah shook his head violently. "No, I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The thing laughed, a sound like grinding stone and shattering glass. "But we knew, and we waited." A flicker of movement caught Elijah's eye. The villagers had stepped forward, all at once, as if controlled by invisible strings. And then they spoke. One mind, one voice, one will. Their words did not match their lips. They spoke in unison, their hollow eyes locked onto Elijah. The church creaked as if the building itself were breathing. Elijah took another step back. His heel caught on something. The book. The cursed, ancient book. He whipped around, falling to his knees, his fingers flipping frantically through the pages. There had to be something. A way to stop this. A way to close the door. The book's pages shifted as if they were alive, as if they knew what he was searching for. And then, there it was. The closing rite. Elijah's pulse pounded as he read the words. The text was barely comprehensible, written in a language older than the church itself. But there was one part he understood. The door must take what it has given. His stomach twisted. A sacrifice. He looked up. The thing watched him. The villagers stood still, their heads tilted unnaturally. The church groaned under an invisible weight, its walls bending in ways they shouldn't. Elijah swallowed hard. "What must I give?" he whispered. The thing took a step forward. Its face changed. One moment an old man, the next a young girl, the next a thing with no face at all. Everything. A rush of cold ran through Elijah's body. His hand shook as he clutched the book tighter. There was no other way. If he ran, the door would remain open. If he hesitated, more would come through. He had caused this. He had to end it. The book trembled in his hands, the ink shifting across the page, the words twisting like serpents. He took a deep breath and began to speak. The church shook. The villagers screamed. The thing lunged. And Elijah knew this was only the beginning. "You said, start with part 5 more unique and lengthy, and give answer in chat, and give answer without title." ChatGPT said. Elijah's voice wavered as he read the words aloud. The ancient syllables burned in his throat, twisting and shifting even as they left his lips. The book pulsed in his hands, as if resisting him, as if it knew he was trying to seal what should never have been opened. The villagers convulsed, their bodies jerking violently, their mouths still whispering, but not in their own voices. The thing at the altar stood motionless, watching him with 1,000 shifting faces. And then it spoke. "Elijah, do you think words will save you?" The walls trembled. The air thickened. Elijah felt his own mind fracturing under the weight of its voice. "You were chosen. You were the door. And you think you can simply close us out?" The laughter that followed wasn't just sound. It was inside him, around him, beneath him. It rattled his bones, made his blood feel like ice in his veins. And then the book snapped shut. Elijah gasped, trying to pry it open again, but the cover sealed itself shut, the leather turning rough and rigid like petrified skin. The words were lost. The rite was broken. A new sound filled the church. A slow, rhythmic knocking. Boom, boom, boom. The villagers turned in unison, their heads snapping toward the church doors. The knocking grew louder. Something was outside. Something that hadn't been there before. Elijah took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The shadows near the door shifted, warping like liquid. And then, the doors exploded inward. A wave of darkness surged through, crashing against the pews, swallowing everything in its path. The villagers collapsed instantly, their bodies contorting unnaturally as they were pulled into the abyss. Their screams, horrible, raw, endless, ripped through the air as the darkness devoured them. Elijah barely managed to throw himself behind the altar. He pressed his hands against the stone, his mind racing. Think. The ritual had failed. The villagers were gone. The thing at the altar still loomed over him, and now something worse had arrived. And then he saw it. A single word remained on the book's cover, etched in deep bleeding letters. Run. Elijah didn't hesitate. He sprinted for the back door, his feet slipping on the blood-stained floor. The moment he reached the threshold, he felt something graze his shoulder. A hand. Cold. Wrong. Too many fingers. He didn't stop. He burst into the night, his lungs burning as he ran through the empty village streets. Behind him, the church collapsed in on itself, the walls imploding as if some invisible force was crushing it into nothingness. But Elijah didn't look back, because he could still hear them. The whispers, the knocking, and worst of all, the laughter. It wasn't over. It was only following him now. Elijah ran. The night swallowed the village in silence, the only sound his own frantic footsteps pounding against the cracked stone road. The cold air sliced through his lungs, but he didn't dare stop, not when he could still hear them. The whispers, the laughter, the knocking. The church was gone, collapsed into the abyss like it had never existed, but that didn't matter. The thing was still here. It wasn't bound by walls or doors anymore. It was free, and it was following him. Elijah turned a sharp corner, nearly slipping as he sprinted past abandoned houses, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets. The village had never truly felt alive, but now it was worse. It felt like a graveyard. Boom, boom, boom. The knocking. It wasn't coming from behind him anymore. It was ahead. Elijah skidded to a stop, his chest heaving. The road stretched out before him, disappearing into the woods at the edge of town. But the trees weren't normal anymore. Their bark twisted and pulsed, their branches forming shapes that looked almost like faces, and at the forest's entrance stood a figure. It was tall. Too tall. Its limbs were too long. And its head. Elijah's stomach twisted. It had no face. Not anymore. It had taken his. Elijah staggered backward, his breath coming in short gasps. The thing in the road tilted its head, mimicking him, moving with a fluidity that was almost amused. Then it spoke, with his own voice. Elijah, do you know what you are? He clutched his head, shaking it violently. No, this isn't real. But we are real, the thing whispered. Its voice was inside him, outside him, beneath his skin. The book had warned him. He hadn't just opened a door. He had become one. And now something had stepped through. The faceless figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. Its fingers twitched, stretching and curling in ways that made Elijah's stomach churn. It's time, Elijah. His own voice, mocking him. He turned and ran again. His legs burned. His lungs screamed for air. The forest loomed ahead, but it was better than standing there. Better than facing himself. The village disappeared behind him, swallowed in darkness. The trees closed in, their branches scraping against his arms, his face. But he kept going, pushing forward, until something grabbed his ankle. Elijah fell hard, his hand scraping against the roots. He barely had time to react before the ground beneath him shifted. Not dirt, not stone, but something living. The forest breathed. Where do you think you're going? The voice was right next to his ear. Elijah screamed. He kicked violently, breaking free, scrambling back, but it was already crawling out of the ground. Not one, not two, dozens. Figures pulling themselves up from the earth, all wearing his face, all whispering his name. He wasn't running from it anymore. He was surrounded, and they were all smiling. Elijah's breath came in ragged gasps as the figures closed in. They moved unnaturally, their limbs bending the wrong way, their heads tilting in eerie synchronization. The whispering filled the air, overlapping voices. Asterisk, asterisk, his own voice. Asterisk, asterisk, hissing his name over and over again. Elijah, Elijah, Elijah. He staggered back, his fingers clawing at the damp earth beneath him, trying to push himself away. But there was nowhere left to go. The faceless ones surrounded him in a tightening circle, their bodies shifting, warping, flickering like candle flames in the wind. Their hands twitched, stretching toward him, and then one of them spoke. "Do you understand now?" Elijah's stomach churned. It was his voice, but it wasn't him. It was hollow, detached, as if something was speaking through him rather than to him. He shook his head violently. "No, I don't. I didn't." "You opened the door," another voice whispered. "You let us in. You let yourself in." The whispers overlapped, a storm of voices clawing into his mind. His vision blurred. His body trembled. Because he did understand now. He hadn't just seen something when he tried to read their minds. He had become part of it. Every thought, every emotion he had ever glimpsed, they had glimpsed him back. And now there was no difference between him and them. The figures took another step forward. Their movements became sharper, more erratic, like puppets jerking on invisible strings. "Let go, Elijah. You are one of us now." "No." Elijah's hands clenched into fists. He wasn't them. He wouldn't become them. The book, the ritual, it had failed, but maybe there was still one way out. He had opened a door. Maybe he could close it. His eyes darted around, scanning the shifting faces. The book was gone, but the words were still inside him. He had read them. He had spoken them. And maybe, if he could say them backwards. Boom, boom, boom. The knocking returned. But this time, it was inside his head. The figures twitched violently, their bodies convulsing, their mouths snapping open. Too wide, too dark, too deep. "We are not done with you, Elijah." Pain lanced through his skull, a pressure so intense it felt like his mind was being peeled apart. But he gritted his teeth. He had to try. He forced the words out, his voice shaking, the syllables twisting in his mouth like living things. The faceless figures screamed. The air shuddered. The ground beneath him split open, revealing a black abyss, shifting, swirling, reaching. The door. It wasn't closed. It was hungry. And now it was pulling them back. One by one, the figures collapsed inward, their bodies twisting and melting into the void. They shrieked in fury, clawing at the air, trying to hold on. But it was too late. They were being ripped away. Elijah's body lurched forward, the force dragging at him, trying to pull him in too. No, 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 no. He dug his fingers into the dirt, fighting against the pull. The last of the figures vanished, their screams fading into the abyss. And then, silence. The ground sealed shut. The whispers stopped. The air went still. Elijah collapsed, his body trembling, his mind aching. It was over. Or at least, he thought it was, until he heard one last whisper. "See you soon, Elijah."